Okay, everybody, good evening. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Fairfax County Democratic Committee Forum entitled A Republic If You Can Keep It. This forum is being recorded. I'm Sandra Klassen, the forum moderator and FCDC National Affairs Committee Chair. Our national affairs forums examine matters of national importance for the purpose of informing, engaging, and inspiring citizen action. I first want to recognize and thank those who contributed to organizing and promoting this forum, including my National Affairs Committee colleagues, Barrett Bogue, Bill Berkson, Howard Carlin, Stephen Hall, Paul Norsey, Michelle Menapace, Sherry Harowitz, Paul Jameson, Walter Carlson, Andrew Scalise, Ernie Kreider, and Ardavan Mobashiri. We also want to thank FCDC Executive Director Jack Corrali, who set up and managed our promotional technology, and finally offer attribution for our graphic to political cartoonist Pat Bagley at the Salt Lake Tribune. After my introduction, our program will proceed in 3 parts. In part 1, our 3 distinguished panelists will deliver presentations laying out their perspective on the threats to our democracy and ways forward. After all 3 speakers have concluded their formal presentations, in part 2, I will invite them to engage each other in a roundtable discussion. Part 3 will be Q&A, where I encourage you forum attendees to write your questions for the speakers in the webinar Q&A box throughout their remarks, not in the chat, if there is one, because we won't be monitoring it. And please specify which speaker or speakers you're directing your questions to. During Q&A, I'll ask a National Affairs Committee colleague to read some of your and the committee's questions to the panelists. Okay, let's begin. On the last day of the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787, Benjamin Franklin was asked whether we had a republic or a monarchy. He replied, "A republic if you could keep it." Today, America confronts a crisis in which we must fight to remain a democratic republic or risk degenerating into authoritarianism and fascism. Whereas once we had a 2-party system, today we have Americans who believe in democracy forced to defend our form of government against a well-armed and well-funded minority of Americans who don't. The current Republican Party, which has become the party of a man without a conscience, supported by his violent right-wing MAGA base, has openly demonstrated that it does not believe in democracy or the core ideals on which this nation was founded. And democracy is inextricably linked to our basic fundamental freedoms and representation. The House Select Committee investigating January 6th and the Department of Justice's own investigation and others have produced compelling evidence that Trump and his supporters engaged in an orchestrated assault on our democracy to silence the free will of the people to choose their representative and prevent the peaceful transfer of power, culminating with the assault on our Capitol. Recent polls reveal that voters name threats to democracy as the most important issue facing the country. And many Americans are increasingly coming to recognize, as conservative federal judge J. Michael Luttig testified before the January 6th committee, that Trump and his allies present a clear and present danger to American democracy. On September 1 at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, President Biden warned us that Donald Trump and his MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic, and that equality and democracy are under assault. This leaves the Democratic Party in its base, and the independents and the bewildered mainstream Republicans who will join us if we speak to them in a language with which they resonate, such as the language of freedom, as the guardians of America's political system. The reality is that if we don't fight, keep fighting, and bring our political allies with us, the forces that want to dismantle democracy will continue to win, state by state, bill by bill, court ruling by court ruling. As Thomas Paine asserted, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. The forum speakers are going to discuss these threats and the fight ahead. And to begin that discussion, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Drew Westen, founder of Westen Strategies, professor of psychology and psychiatry at Emory University, political message consultant, and author. He formerly taught at the University of Michigan and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Westen is the author of 3 books and over 150 scholarly articles, including The Political Brain, The Role of Emotion in Deciding the Fate of the Nation. This book has influenced campaigns and elections around the world. He has been a frequent contributor on political and psychological issues on radio, television, and print. He has advised a range of organizations, from presidential and prime ministerial campaigns in the US and internationally, to nonprofits on a wide range of issues, to Democratic caucuses of the US Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as state Democratic and progressive organizations and caucuses around the country. Also, in 2011, the Democratic Party of Virginia convened a state summit that I co-chaired and invited Dr. Westen to keynote. I'm happy to say Virginia Democrats gave him about 10 standing ovations. Dr. Westen, we are eager to hear your remarks. Please go ahead. Dr. Westen, are you having trouble with your microphone?
I just got myself fully unmuted.
Okay,
great. Thanks very much, Sandra, both for the very kind introduction and for pulling together this this forum. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have a feeling some of my remarks may be controversial, but I've got John and David there to see if they can out-controverse me. So we'll see how that goes. I'll begin by making a statement that is, in essence, psychologically what I sort of speaks in one sentence what I have to say, which is that I'm really concerned that we have one side right now that is stockpiling AR-15s and another side that's stockpiling affidavits. Frankly, I would really rather be the side that's stockpiling the AR-15s. I would rather us not be in that position. But what I want to say is that although obviously 70% of the blame for where we are as a country, its divisiveness, et cetera, it really began with Newt Gingrich going after Bill Clinton personally, and the beginnings of the just complete disintegration of political civility. I'm going to suggest that we on the left, us Democrats, are complicit in a good bit of what has happened, in large part because of our fear of aggression, our misunderstanding of bully dynamics, and our inability to respond to them. And we have needed to respond to them for quite some time. Just to give you one example of what I mean by that, in 2016, it was February, I believe, when Antonin Scalia died, and Mitch McConnell announced that he was not going to pay any attention to the Constitution and would instead not consider any nominee for the Supreme Court proposed by President Obama, who at that time was less than 2 months into the last year of his presidency. And you can scream at Mitch McConnell for that, and he certainly deserved our opprobrium for it. But you can also really scream at the Democratic leadership of the Senate for that, because when a political party says we're no longer going to honor the Constitution in such a fundamental way, you can't say, okay, well, we'll duck down and seek cover. You have to take a really tough stance. And the question you might ask is, what kind of stance could we have taken? And I was not in the room for the deliberations of the caucus at that time, but had I been, I would have suggested that the caucus come out with a statement through its leader that last I looked at the Constitution, presidents serve 4-year terms. And what you are doing is unconstitutional. You're basically saying, no, you decided to shorten the term of this president to 7 years. If you do that, I just want to let you know that we've taken a vote in the caucus, and you could be basically holding off an appointment for a Republican president who'll put someone in who'll be there for 40 years. So for the next 40 years, if you do this, we as a caucus, the next time you have a president who's Republican and we have a Senate that's Democratic, we will not vote on any federal appointee at any level by a Republican president. And that's going out 4 decades. So I recommend that you obey a constitution and follow the mandate of it, and that we proceed accordingly. And that may sound like a harsh thing. It may sound like something that would have been unprecedented, but stealing that vote was a pretty important vote, and we knew it would be. And you can't play when the other side or you can't shoot blanks when the other side has live ammunition. Similarly, now to go back to something that's more current, and this is something I'm sure John will speak about. I don't know what he'll say about it, but hopefully he won't tell me that I'm a psychologist masquerading as a charlatan lawyer. But on January 7th, I believe that we were in the position to do what any normal country, particularly a democracy, which relies on the consent of the governed, would have done, which is to round up the insurrectionists, starting with the insurrectionist in chief. We should certainly have never let the people who had breached the Capitol leave the Capitol. There were 140 plus members of Congress who, after that breach, nevertheless continued with their quest to refuse President Biden his elected presidency by voting against electors. And again, I'll leave this to John to explain to us the difference between a co-conspirator and an accomplice after the fact. But whether or not they were co-conspirators, which many of them appear to have been, they were clearly accomplices after the fact at that point. They understood that this was a coup attempt. They're not stupid. They understood that their president stood at the beginning and said, please come out and have a coup. Please follow me. And they did. It's been said many times that had the people who were breaching the Capitol been young black men in hoodies or Black Lives Matter protesters, they would have been gunned down in a heartbeat before they got within 25 yards of the Capitol. Certainly, as soon as they breached the first barrier, and the fact that they were sent home, that they were, go home, have a nice dinner for the next year. If we track you down, maybe we'll call it trespassing for the first few of you. No country would have ever, to my knowledge, have done that other than one, maybe, which actually responded more harshly than that, which was Weimar Germany when Hitler attempted his first coup. But you can't, in a democracy, send either the message that it's okay to let that happen and not to do anything, or to send the meta message by, in fact, doing nothing for as long as the Justice Department did absolutely nothing. And the reason why I'm saying do absolutely nothing, I don't care what they collected. What I do know is that they collected tens of millions of election deniers over the next year and a half. They allowed the creation of an alternative narrative. At that moment, we needed the declaration that this president, who should have been in prison, along with his members of Congress and his other married men who were there, married men and a few women, that we should have made him out to be what he was, which was Osama bin Laden. And he was no different from Osama bin Laden, other than he was an American citizen. And I believe George W. Bush created a great place in Gitmo to put people like him, and really nice, nice procedures for getting information out of them. Although I think you probably wouldn't have needed them for Donald Trump. But the point is that you can't allow an alternative narrative to get started like that and to go on for months and months and months, if for no other reason that where would we ever now find? I mean, it's great that Letitia James is pursuing civil penalties against the Trump organization, and hopefully, if she has her allegations and her evidence in a row, which I'm sure she does, there'll be civil convictions. But in terms of getting criminal convictions, where are we ever going to find a jury of 12 people that doesn't include some Trumper on it? And that's why you have to brand seditionists as seditionists immediately after they commit their acts or while they're committing their acts. You simply can't let them go out back onto the street because you're endangering the country, especially when one of them is with a sizable minority of the country, as we heard him refer to the other day, Orange Jesus. So I think it was a phenomenal error. A lot of people have said that we came close, but that the institutions of our democracy held. I would say that they did not hold at all. They held momentarily. We put our finger in the dike and we have held it momentarily. But the fact that cops were killed and no one was put in prison for it, immediately for the cop killing. Maybe John can answer this question for me, but if a 16-year-old Black teenager is recruited by a couple of his buddies or as part of an initiation to a gang, is told, hey, wait outside, I'm robbing the 7-Eleven, no one's going to get hurt, don't worry about it, and they shoot and someone gets hurt inside, he's an accomplice. And I don't understand how it could be that the hundreds of people who breached the Capitol walls were not accomplices to what occurred there, regardless of what they individually did. I mean, we don't tend to treat cop killers very well in this country. We don't tend to give unconditional amnesty to them or call them trespassers or say, I'm really sorry that you dropped some, you smeared some feces in on the speaker's wall. We'll call that a bad job of interior decorating. It frankly, to me, is unfathomable what we did. Trump had been sitting for years with Mein Kampf as a guide on his nightstand, from what reports have said. And I don't know what the Democrats were sitting with, maybe a history of Weimar Germany, but that they didn't read what happened after the early 30s. It's hard to understand. But what I'm going to suggest is that we had plenty of warning that this was coming, and that there is a flaw in the Democratic mind and possibly the Democratic brain, which if I get a chance, I'll say something about that, because there's some really interesting research over the last 7-8 years on the differences between the brains of liberals and conservatives. And one of the things that I found in doing international consulting is that the difficulty dealing with aggression, the inability to understand bully dynamics, the tendency to show up at a gunfight with a plastic knife, is true of progressive parties all over the world. It is not just an American phenomenon. I thought it was something about Democrats in the U.S. But we heard lots of warning. I mean, it's ironic that the biggest warning cry we heard from early on in the Trump presidency was from a comic, Bill Maher, who started warning at the very beginning of his presidency, this guy's not going to leave. And I remember watching and thinking, does anybody not know this? And it seemed like our side was caught flat-footed, which again is a pretty remarkable thing. I was really struck, as I imagine some others were, about something that happened in the October election in 2020, and the October debate between Trump and future President Biden. And that was when Trump was asked about these white nationalist groups, and he said, well, he was asked, well, do you have somebody in mind? And he said, or they asked him to name one. He said, yeah, the Proud Boys. I don't know if anyone else was struck by this. I mean, I was, like everyone else, I was horrified by his stand down and stand by comment. I was equally horrified by the fact that he knew the name of the one of them, because when President Obama and then Vice President Biden were in the White House, when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were in the White House, they would have known the name of that group because they would have read daily presidential briefings, and they would have been briefed on white supremacist groups that are terrorist organizations that posed a clear and present danger to the United States. In Trump's case, he didn't read those things, as best we understand. Maybe he got picture books that he was allowed to look through, and occasionally did. But his only acquaintance with the Proud Boys would not have been as a terrorist group. It would have been as a co-conspirator. I mean, I don't know how else you would know the name of this fringe group as president of the United States, unless you were tracking them as a danger, which he clearly wasn't. That later that month, I wrote a piece that was about the former president's mental health, called "All the President's Mental Disorders," and it was a long piece, so it could only have been published in a place like the Atlantic or maybe the New Yorker or the Rolling Stone. But in it, I made my prior career was as a psychiatric diagnostician, and I did a lot of research in psychiatric diagnosis and particularly personality disorders. And I went pretty carefully through what are the diagnostic criteria for a range of disorders that were were possibilities for him, of which he had multiple that he made the diagnoses and made them very obviously. I mean, there are very few people who make 8 out of 8 criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, and who make virtually all the criteria for psychopathic personality if you measure it from the way it's measured in forensic by forensic psychologists and psychiatrists and used in prisons. And he met the criteria for those as well. But as with many people who carry a diagnosis of psychopathic personality, or some untreated or poorly treated patients with bipolar disorder, who also have personality disorders on top of their bipolar illness, and you sometimes see a phenomenon that we saw in him, which was that it was very often difficult to tell when he was lying, when he believed his own lies, and I think both of those things happen with him. And the third is when he really couldn't distinguish reality from non-reality. And I think we saw plenty of instances of that as well. When he could say with a straight face that he looked at the pictures and said, "Look how many more people I have than Barack Obama on the mall for my inauguration." I don't think he was just lying. He had a number in that piece I wrote about a number of functional abnormalities that concerned me, because the only experts we saw on television around that time were people who were not experts, people like George Conway, who had really interesting things to say.
Drew, you have 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes.
Well, in that case, I'm going to move very quickly to where I wanted to head. So I'm giving you a very dire portrait at the moment. I'll add one more dire piece, and then I'll give you something hopeful. So the last dire piece is that I think we're facing 2 really huge dangers today, and I don't hear the Democrats talking enough about either one of them. One of them is that I think the chances are better than 50-50 that if the Republicans win the House, the next House Speaker will be Donald Trump, because the Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of Congress, and there's no more powerful Republican. And so if he challenges Kevin McCarthy, which one of them do you think is going to win? We'll then see. He will investigate all of his own investigators. He'll start an impeachment trial against the man who is president, and who knows what will happen to our democracy after that. The other is that there are at least 5 candidates for elected offices in 5 swing states, at the very least, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, who could decide that they simply will not accept if the results of a Democratic election, if it comes out for the Democrat with a capital D. And those election officials could, if they get elected, they could simply decide, I'm not going to turn in any electors, even if they didn't want to turn in false ones. and it would go to the House of Representatives. And I won't get into the details of why that would probably lead, despite, even if the Democrats win the House, to the House selecting Trump. It has to do with some ridiculous math in the Constitution. But so those are a couple of major concerns. Let me wrap up by saying here's something positive. So the Dobbs decision has shown us just how much of a difference it makes to Americans to have rights taken away. I think a lot of our messaging on this has been poor. You know, we Democrats are great at turning something really close to people's hearts into something as distant, abstract, acronymized, and academic as we can possibly make it, turn it into activist speak. So that, I mean, coming up with the term bodily autonomy, I have to say, that's a brilliant stroke. If you really want to take an issue that is impossible to take away from something things that are close to you, who do you the freedom to decide whether, when, or with whom to have a family, the act of having sex, to turn that into bodily autonomy. I mean, congratulations. The reproductive health, reproductive justice, reproductive, what's the other one? Reproductive freedom, which is the best of the three. You know, most of us don't think about having sex or having a family in terms of reproductive anything. We're not thinking about anatomical maps of the uterus or of the testes. That's not where we go. Reproductive justice, by the way, most Americans cannot define. I had to look it up to figure out exactly what it really meant. It's like environmental justice, which I've tested, where less than 10% of Americans can define that term as well. What I will say is that there is a way out of those kinds of problems. We can message our way out of that. We can make that affirmative statement that I made a minute ago about what is Dobbs, what is Roe about? It's about the freedom to decide whether, when, and who to have a kid with, who to have a family with. That's how we ought to talk about it. But the flip side, and this is where you put on the brass knuckles, is that there's a couple things that we can say to differentiate ourselves from the other side. And I'll do this in 30 more seconds, Sandra, so you don't have to move forward and backwards to cue me that I'm done. But
you're perceptive there, Drew.
Oh, I am a trained psychologist after all. But the one is, if you're in a debate with a candidate from the other side, it is not difficult to say, you know, the difference between us is that you believe that every rapist has the right to choose the mother of his child. I believe that every woman has the right to choose the father of hers. Pretty difficult to squirm your way out of that one. I'll just give you one more example like that. Right now, in Ukraine, Russian soldiers are raping Ukrainian women, girls, and teenagers. We call that a war crime. You call that a culture of life. It's the difference between us. And frankly, most Americans find that, or the idea of forcing a 10-year-old to have the child of a rapist, to be as deeply immoral as you can possibly get. And if that's the concept of morality you want to force on the rest of us because your God whispered something into your ear that 70% of our gods did not whisper, I think the American people have a pretty clear choice between us.
Thank you, Drew. Excellent, as I know you would be. We look forward to hearing some more from you during the roundtable discussion and Q&A. Now I'm going to move forward. I'm honored to introduce John P. Flannery II. Mr. Flannery is a litigator, former federal prosecutor, Hill counsel, and a regular guest commentator on TV and radio on law and politics, including MSNBC. You've probably frequently seen him on The Beat with Ari Melber, CNN, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, and CNBC. In private practice in a Manhattan law firm, John represented all of the airlines in the 1981 air traffic controllers strike and negotiated a multi-million-dollar settlement for the airlines. Mr. Flannery also served twice on Capitol Hill, on the Senate side as special counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee to investigate Gaddafi's efforts to subvert American foreign policy, and then as special counsel to the U.S. Senate Labor Committee to investigate the confirmation hearings of a former labor secretary. On the House side, he served again as special counsel, investigating the mob's influence in the laborers and Teamsters international unions. His most challenging assignment on the Hill, however, was his work on the impeachment proceedings of President William Jefferson Clinton, for the Democratic minority, of course. After Congress, John returned to civil and criminal trial and appellate federal and state litigation practice. Please proceed, Mr. Flannery.
Well, thank you for those kind words. Years ago, I ran for Congress and I managed to get 95,000 votes, but the voters decided I should remain a trial lawyer instead. And one of the questions was I that same guy? So maybe I still look like the same person. A friend of mine, when I announced, heard some radio discussion of it, and he said, I listened, and they said, you did this, and then you did that, and then you did the other thing. And I could only draw one conclusion. This guy can't hold a job. So there is and I suppose I share with Drew these kinds of experiences, but if you can synthesize these different things, I think it's the only way to approach the problems that we have. And I'm honored to be both with Drew and David. I very much enjoyed what Drew had to say, and I don't think you could put a thin sheet of paper between us on our views. The current situation is the most encouraging today, this day, within recent 24 hours, because I believe there's blood in the water in the sense of the MAGA conspiracy. Rudy's had his law license suspended, hasn't chilled him enough. Steve Bannon has been convicted and will be sentenced in October. Trump has been being held accountable with his children, as they've been described, though they're 30s and 40s, for the tune of $250 million in deceptions involving the overstatement of valued real estate for purposes of getting debt loans and undervaluing it for the purpose of paying taxes. And this is the tune in which they're stealing the money from Americans. The Florida search case also suggests to us that somebody is finally looking at a very serious crime that involves our national security. We do have Ginny Thomas going to the January 6th committee to testify. I really don't expect much from her, but I do think it says something that she feels she has to go. And the implications of what she did or didn't do in the efforts to overthrow the government strikes me as more important to the fact that she's doing this while her husband's on the Supreme Court, and the single judge who made a ruling in one of the cases separate and apart from the other 8 members of the committee. And the trouble with the Supreme Court, and reflected in our other courts now, is that starting with Rehnquist and his decision to decide the presidential election in a 5-4 decision in 2000, has been followed by faithfully by a former law clerk, Roberts, who was his law clerk, followed by Alito, delivering upon what Drew properly describes as a significant issue in the election for the dehumanizing of women, the slavery of women, the fear that they would have power and equality, and that they don't have a right to be let alone, and they don't have a right to dominion over their own bodies. And that says a lot more than that issue. That issue is a part of an entire framework that they're dealing with. And then we finish up most recently with Judge Luce Cannon, as I call her. Luce is not part of her formal name, but I do think it's a fair description without going into too much detail about how totally baseless was her factual and legal decision in that case. And to finish up the, I think, encouraging signs was that the 11th Circuit, at a time when we're concerned if we can trust our courts, they basically shut down Luce Cannon and said that she's not going to hold up the investigation of the 100 documents that appear to involve top secret and other classified materials. The additional encouraging aspect is that the special master that they appointed, who was totally unnecessary and unlawfully, in my opinion, even to contemplate a separation of powers question, like how the courts can say what the executive can investigate in these circumstances involving the national security. And it's very interesting that since that decision by the judge, or remark by the judge, we have Trump going around talking about how he has a kind of a magic wand by which he waves it across documents and they're declassified because in his mind, small place, they are declassified. And so that's it, which is a variation on the Nixon description years ago of if the president does it, it's the law. So it's not surprising that from the time of Hamilton forward, the Federalists have always thought they want a unitary executive, which is basically monarchical. And even John Adams, that we praise so much, spent a lot of his time as the vice president in the Senate talking about whether we should be calling George Washington His Excellency. And Hamilton, of course, was very comfortable with the notion of monarchy and said so. So from that day to this, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the notion of democracy versus autocracy. And that is an explanation, a prime mover for all of these things that we see. Let me go over some, I think, material facts, because one of my assignments was to figure out, and it's obvious to me and probably all of you, one of my assignments was to figure out what laws are being violated. And it's easier to put it the other way if you're into set theory, what laws are not being violated. Now, I appeared with Ari Melber the other day, and he has put together a great chart outlining, in my opinion, what is a single conspiracy to overthrow the government. And he had a couple of items that he wasn't sure or didn't define in his mind as criminal. And one of them was the court cases that were all dismissed. I think that is a major part of the conspiracy to overthrow the government, because all of those court cases, every one of them was dismissed. Why? Because there were no facts and there was no law that upheld them. That's not an accident. It is a crime to submit false statements and pleadings to the court. You can ask Rudy Giuliani, who's had his license suspended and hopefully it'll be pulled away from him. Sidney Powell, the same thing. So my amendment to Ari's chart was that the court cases are part of the conspiracy. Another one was then going to electors to say, you should go in and you should challenge the result, the seating of Biden as the president, because you dissent from what the regularly elected electors did. I think that's also a crime, because these people had to make statements that were false, that are critical parts of the conspiracy going forward. The Attorney General, we have another one. We have Rosen, who was the acting Attorney General, and they're trying to push him out of the way so Clark can come in and say, hey, down in Florida, those votes should be changed. What we need is all the votes that Biden got plus one more so that we win. Now, any of us who've spent any time in any election, going back probably even to grammar school, understand that that's not how it works. You don't lose and then say, give me the votes to make up the difference so that I can win. Well, third world countries sometimes do that. This is the first time, pardon the expression, we're admitting to being a banana Republican, at least on that's a Republican, that's a good one, at least on that side of the equation where we find the Republicans. So in this early stage of court cases and electors, we have none other than Steve Bannon, who's the great wizard, Rudy, who when he's sober still makes bad decisions. And he and I were prosecutors together. I sold my apartment to him in New York when we were young puppy prosecutors, and he had not yet, I don't know, drunk the water, the silly water, the orange water. And then they had Eastman, who pretends to be a lawyer from the West Coast, who put together the music by which they were going to challenge the election, having no basis in law and no basis in fact. So they are trying to sell this through Rosen and Clark, who will take over as the acting AG, and then send a letter to Georgia and say, hey, Georgia, this is what you got to do. You got to send alternate electors. And this even ended up in the Oval Office. And the amazing thing in this case, and people say, oh, do we have enough evidence to go after these guys? Trump has all these meetings with a room full of people and says all these things. This is, a first-year law student might be able to try this case, maybe with a little senior lawyer to help him. And when I've gotten together with former assistants since then, we've joked about how we would take a couple of us and we would try these cases, because this stuff is so outrageous and there's so much evidence that I don't know how you couldn't prosecute. And the Florida case, the Secretary of State has tape recordings of Trump asking him to do this. It's rare that you get people to admit to their own crime as it's going on. And he did. And we have a Georgia prosecutor who's still looking at it. So then what do we have? We have Navarro and Meadows are circulating stuff to people on the Hill to help this work on January the 6th, when they're going to count the electors to see whether or not Biden, who this should be a pro forma experience, is going to be our president or not. And senators and representatives were involved in this. Hundreds were involved. And they were briefing people who are going to run through the streets on January the 6th. And so we have a conversation with the rabble, if you will, among the senators and congressmen. And we have cooperation with them. And we have these people setting up a nerve center at a prominent hotel in DC with Stone outside holding court with one of their gangland associates, one of these groups. And then that's not enough. We don't stop there. We try to coerce the vice president of the United States to do something after consulting with the most conservative Republican lawyers that he decides he can't do, and they're still after him. And he's threatened by the mob, and this is suffered silently by Trump, that they should hang him, just as they should kidnap the Speaker of the House in the succession to the presidency. And people do die, and people do not show up. There is no law enforcement people on the ground sufficient to beat this back. And it took, as I understand it, Pence and Pelosi and some other people to get people on the Hill to help with this. And they tried to convince Pence to leave the area. So they figured if they could push it for another day, perhaps they would prevail. That is a single conspiracy. Every person in that thing knew what was going on. And it's interesting that Bannon said in September, before the election was over, that, hey, if he loses, he'll just say he won. And on the night of the election, with Rudy half in his drunk, he goes to have an audience with the president and says 4 words, just say we won. That is an undeniable effort to overthrow our government. And Drew and I are 100% on this. If a kid were to do something in your household, you could say, go sit in the corner for a while, immediately. When we see other crimes being prosecuted, what do we hear? Immediately we're saying, oh, who is the guy who did it? Or women, or people, or gang, or whatever. And what are we going to do? Have we arrested them yet? What happened? Not an effort to overthrow the government? Enviable. He didn't even have to burn down the Reichstag to get away with this, it would appear, because we do nothing. And for a year and a half, nothing happens. Who do we chase? And then what do we charge them with? Trespassing and things like that. So, you know, some people have asked me what I would have done at the beginning. I would have called the principals into the grand jury and locked in their story the day afterwards. I would call some of these people we see waving to the rabble, encouraging them in what they're doing, the people who set up meetings to explain how you get through the tunnels on the Hill. I'd call up the people to see how those bombs were placed near the Republican headquarters and near the Democratic headquarters. It's obvious what you do. This is not complicated, but you have to wonder why prosecutors like me across the country, who would just salivate to uncover such a terrible crime, the crime of the century, the crime of history in America, that a president would sell us out, a guy who had been subjected, if you will, to a master, Putin, who is now committing his own crazy crimes. Talk about the world being upside down, that we could for a moment think that it's tolerable that Trump and Putin are connected in his first election. And now there are national security papers. We don't know who got them or where they are. And this is not a big concern. So first of all, I think that my friend Ari's description of the critical elements, I think that's one conspiracy. The object is to overthrow the government. It involves all manner of preparation in the states, all manner of misrepresentation, all manner of lies, incitement to rebel, speeches by the then president, by Rudy Giuliani, and by this cracker Eastman, who came up with this theory that is not based in law or fact, because it relies on there being misconduct in the election. So what's missing? I've been asked, why haven't we done anything? Why did all this time pass? We lack resolve. We lack cohesion. We don't use the resources we have. We don't show the initiative sufficient to the task. We talk about in fractions, but without action.
5 minutes, John.
That's a failure of a democracy that you would interrupt me. So what do I see here? To simplify it, there are a couple of points. Biden gave a speech recently at Independence Hall, and he turned to the two basic documents in America, our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. The Declaration provides that we are all equal under the law. The Constitution says we the people, that is, it's a democracy, we the people do these things. And the MAGA nuts, they placed the dagger, this is the exact words of Biden, placed the dagger to the throat of our democracy, but they look at themselves as patriots. I leave that analysis to Drew, which he's partly done already. They believe that in an election, they win or they're cheated. We have an abundance of hand-wringing. We're so easy on empathy, but we don't have warriors among our Democrats. We don't go to fight. If you can't draw the line and fight, then how do you expect to stop this? You can't win an argument you don't make, but you can't win a fight that you don't have. The Irish, of course, come dripping wet naked to an alien shore and they say, who's the government? I'm against them. Well, Trump's crazy people seem to have that down. And just the other evening, he had a series of his Nazi-like rallies in which he's revving them up. And in the most recent one, he's now apparently tried to assume the role of the QAnon conspiracy leader. And at one point in the crowd, they started pointing their finger, evocative of Nazi salutes and so forth. This is what we're dealing with. And this doesn't concern us. There have been instances when, for example, in Ibsen's Enemy of the People, a person who tried to help the community, he's treated as the enemy, though he's trying to save them. That's what we have here. So Biden properly said you can't be pro-American and pro-insurgent, but you can't expect the rule of law to be enforced. You can't expect to have free and fair elections. You can't expect to represent the will of the people if you don't fight for it. We slowly came to help those who were in Ukraine. We've made a difference there, perhaps. Maybe we'll even win it. We have to do the same thing at home. It's not enough to talk about it to hope that'll get you through the midterms. What's going to get us through the midterms is calling out what they actually did. And how do we do that? We first of all prosecute the case. The strongest cases we know. The New York Attorney General has created a template to be prosecuted by IRS, by the Southern District of New York. My former office has, to my mind, failed America, and to go forward with that. That's one case. And what she's doing is she's basically taking their money away from them, their ability to raise money, their ability to start corporations, and that's great. The second case that I think is important is the one I've mentioned in Georgia. They have a tape recording, indict them. And it'll be interesting if the only prosecutions are brought by women in New York and in Georgia, but I think that's entirely possible. We use truth to win, and that's what has saved us, but we need action to work with it. When Harry S. Truman was running for the presidency in 1948, somebody shouted in the crowd, "Give him hell, Harry." And he says, I'm not giving them hell, but I'm calling them on the truth, and it feels like hell. Well, that's just fine and good, but we have to do the things that apply that strength to the action of punishing people who break the law. If no one is really above the law, then this guy Trump is a one-man crime wave, and we have to do something about it. And the final recommendation that I think I have, besides prosecuting these variety of crimes that we've outlined, is that what we need is a strike force. We need the clear and present danger strike force consisting of law enforcement up and down the East Coast from both federal, state, and local to take on this case and bring this guy to judgment, because it is not tolerable to have him have this freedom and be in this position right now. So those are a few of my soft expressions about this matter.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that. It is now with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, David Pepper. David Pepper is an attorney, election and voting rights law teacher, former Ohio Democratic Party chair from 2015 to 2021, and author of Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines, as well as 4 novels. He earned his BA from Yale University and his JD from Yale Law School. He has clerked for a judge on the United States Court of Appeals, served in local elected office in Ohio, worked for major law firms, and teaches election and voting rights law. Prior to law school, Mr. Pepper worked in St. Petersburg, Russia, for the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies. Please welcome David Pepper. Mr. Pepper, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra. Great to be with you. Great to be with such a great panel of people I've long admired and worked with a little bit in the past with Drew. I'll cut right to the chase. I'm going to pick up where the others have left off. And like John said, I agree with so much what everyone said. But I'm going to take us from sort of the January 6th in federal aspect and Trump aspect of the attack on democracy and take us much more to the ground floor and to make sure we see the whole picture. But I'm also going to try and tell us what we all can do as opposed to only being sort of depressed and somewhat somber about the bad things that are happening, because I do all that I do because I'm an optimist. It's late in the game, but we can still save the day. So let me share my screen here. I'm going to go through something quite quickly that I normally take a little longer on, but I think I should be able to get it done. So we like to think of politics as a single battle. We think of it as sort of a battle between red and blue, don't we? That's kind of how it's talked about. And on the left side of the battle is how I think most Democrats, and Sandra, in your opening, you showed me you don't think about it this way, which is good, but most Democrats, most in the media, most mainstream folks, independents, even some Republicans, they see it as sort of a battle between red and blue that we all talk about. And this side sort of assumes that democracy is intact. We're America, so it's intact, it's pretty much stable. And this side, again, Democrats mainly, is actually quite confident that they represent a majority of Americans on most issues, which they do, be it being pro-choice and supporting Roe v. Wade, be it being for common sense gun reform, a middle-class based economy, pro-collective bargaining, you name it. The truth is these folks do represent mainstream majority of America. This side, because of these two things, it believes in the democracy is intact and believes that that it stands with the majority of Americans. It chooses its political battle to be a battle over election outcomes. Go say what you're for. The majority agrees with you. Say it hopefully as well as Drew Westen says it, although most people do not do that. That's a problem. And you'll win elections and then get what you want to get done. And this side also quite quickly, because it's efficient, decides the best way to do that is to win federal elections. Those are the elections that if we win, we have superpower across this country to get our agenda done. And so this side quickly hones in on swing states in federal years. That's where it puts most of its money. That's where it puts most of its energy. That's where almost all the focus goes. Democrats, the media, again, that's sort of the basic frame that most people think about politics. And when this side wins those federal elections in those federal years in those swing states, this side celebrates like it's just won everything, doesn't it? Like 2020 or 2008. Here's the problem. The other side's battle is actually quite different. And that side's celebration is premature because that battle does not encompass the entire battlefield. The other side has a broader battlefield. What's the other side's battle? The side on the right, and this is sort of the far, far right. I wouldn't throw every Republican into this, although it's getting more and more to be if you watch a lot of what's happening. The side on the right of this little breakdown, they actually understand correctly that democracy can be subverted and has many times in our history and often around the world. It happens all the time. A few things here and there, and all of a sudden democracy can be subverted. This side also understands for its part, and unlike the Democrats, they understand, as you said early on, Sandra, that they actually represent a minority viewpoint. This side understands that, like what happened in Kansas the other day, most people support Roe v. Wade, even in Kansas, even in Texas. They understand that banning books is unpopular. They understand that people want to deal with climate change. They know that extreme trickle-down economics leaves too many people out to be popular. They know all this. They know that extreme gun laws arming teachers, you name it, aren't popular ideas? Do they give up knowing these things are toxic? No, they understand. Look at Mitch McConnell telling Lindsey Graham to not talk about abortion because he knows that people could say what Drew Westen was just saying. He knows that if Rick Scott were to talk about his economic agenda, that they would lose. So Mitch McConnell tells him, don't say anything. This side knows that on a repeated fair playing field, their minority worldview would lose, and they could never impose it on the rest of us. They don't quit, though, because once they understand that, they just choose a different battle, don't they? Their battle isn't to go out and say what they're for in a fair playing field. Their battle is imposing a minority worldview over time by what? Their battle is over democracy itself. How to avoid those elections as much as possible in a fair playing field. How to avoid that Kansas statewide referendum. How to subvert democracy, in other words. Once that is their battle plan looks very different. And by the way, just to go through, here's some of the items in their agenda that are all underwater. This is the things they want to get done. But once they've chosen their battle, they make an observation that we have failed to make and that John hinted at, that for their battle, the most important institution in their battle is what my book's about. It's the state houses, stupid, as James Carville would say. Those are the places, if you want to put into place a system that subverts democracy and allows you to impose a minority worldview over time, state houses are the place to go. That's why I call them laboratories of autocracy. Why? One, state houses control every single issue these people care about and that we care about, as well as every major contested issue in politics is determined at the state house as much or usually more than Congress for the people in that state. We're all seeing that every day. All these state laws on guns and abortion, it's all coming out of states. It's almost never coming out of Congress. States have this extraordinary power. One major problem is no one knows anything about that. So these states, because they're anonymous and powerful, end up being a perfect place to go if you want to get your agenda put into place when no one's paying attention. But even more powerfully, states also have a massive role in shaping the democracy of this country. They write the election rules that determine who votes and who maybe can't vote and how people vote and how you register, how you get knocked off the rolls. States determine that almost in that entirely. As Drew suggests, the federal government should be doing more and fighting harder on this stuff, but it hasn't. So states are generally writing these rules. Number two, states draw the district lines. So states are the ones that can, for the most part, a few states have had reforms, but for the most part, state houses are the institutions that determine, do we have a competitive democracy where people have choice, or is every single election predetermined? That's a big decision that they make. If your goal in life is to impose a minority worldview, ramming through issues that are unpopular, that's a wonderful tool that state houses have to help you do that. They can basically suppress democracy by locking incumbents in no matter what they do. And as Donald Trump figured out too late in the process, state houses also have major control over the electoral college process. And we'll be debating in coming years how much. On the second point, I won't go through a lot of details, but it turns out the power over districting is enormous power once you throw in modern day computer technology and intense partisanship. Even states like in 18, where Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin had a majority of that state choose a Democrat for their state house. The gerrymandering from 2011, which was when it's been more intense any time in our history, was so extreme that even then, look at Wisconsin, a decisive majority voting for a Democrat for their state house translated into a supermajority for that same party in their state house. But they've gone even further. I won't go through a lot of details. In many of these state houses, it's not only that they're earning majority, that they're gaining majorities they don't earn, which again, Putin and Orban would be impressed by what happened in Wisconsin 18, by the way. They are actually creating a system where almost not a single one of these people has ever been in a real election. These are the margins of victories in 62 seats in Ohio over a decade. And you'll see that because we have 8-year term limits, these are people who essentially are never in real elections, ever. They never worry. As Drew said, and as John said, they never face accountability. And just like Donald Trump with no accountability is dangerous, elected officials in power who actually face no accountability are really dangerous. Why is that? We have a set of assumptions that we put, a set of incentives that we assume lead to good behavior in public service. But that assumption flows from the sense that there's accountability on election day. You know, when you're running in a competitive election, you want to show the people of your district, I delivered good public outcomes. I lifted my schools, I lifted wages, I improved infrastructure. Once you're guaranteed your outcome, no matter what, like this chart shows you, public outcomes no longer matter. What does matter is keeping certain private interests in that state house happy. And a lot of those private interests, like, you know, energy utilities, for-profit online school scams, payday lenders, what do they want? Generally, they want the opposite of what the public wants. So you're doing better in these rigged systems by pushing for those private interests that undermine public outcomes, as opposed to pushing for public outcomes, because the people back home can't get rid of you anyway. There's also an enormous incentive to be an extremist. Being, you know, in a competitive race, in a competitive district, you want to be mainstream. You want to reflect your people. But if you're guaranteed that outcome no matter what, guess what? Your biggest fear is a primary, and the way you avoid a primary is being an extremist. And the one thing, of course, once you've behaved like an extremist and once you deliver terrible public outcomes, the one other major incentive that you have in life is to never in the future allow for a real democracy, because your extremism and indefensible public outcomes would actually mean you'd lose for sure. So that's why they keep having to subvert democracy once they've chosen this path. It turns out that this is the perfect place for those reasons on the right to accomplish their agenda, which is subverting democracy. That's literally, the state house is the place to do it for the reasons I've described. And again, I'm doing this very quickly. So I ask you, when you look at these two sides, and this gets to Drew's point about being tough, if the side on the left simply keeps battling for a few swing states in a few federal years, and the side and only does battle there, and the side on the right actually is going for the heart of democracy in state houses, and then when they win a state house, they ram their agenda through, and they gerrymander so they don't lose that state house in the future, and they keep doing that, who's going to win the battle? Over time, the side on the right is clearly going to win. They're always on offense against democracy and for extremism. The Democrats are essentially only on defense, especially since even when they win the Senate, they're not tough enough to protect democracy. So over time, my son who plays soccer, he's 8 years old, would say, well, Dad, the team on offense is always going to win. You know you've got a problem when you win what you think you're supposed to win, and it turns out you're still losing. Democrats thought they won everything they were supposed to win in 20, didn't they? The presidency, the Senate, and the House. But a year later, we don't feel like we're winning for the battle for democracy, do we? It's because we don't have the right battle plan. We're on defense in a few places. They're on offense everywhere. Okay, that's the negative part, Sandra. I promised I'd get positive. What does the side on the left have to do? Figure out what the battle really is. It is, as you said when you started, we are in a battle for democracy. And it's not just Donald Trump, and it's not just January 6th. It's deeper. It's in every state, and it began before Donald Trump ever ran for office. And it's driven by more than just Trump and his folks. We have to, in our mind, reframe the battle to realize this is a battle for democracy itself. And with that adjustment in our mind come a lot of clarifying observations and strategies. The first thing you realize is the battle for democracy is a long battle. It's not just about the next cycle. You don't quit in December after a November election. You don't give up because you didn't win some of the federal seats you wanted to win. It's the same battle the suffragists fought. It's the same battle John Lewis fought. Generations fighting so those who came behind them would enjoy a more diverse democracy. Who's an example of a modern day person who saw this battle as a long game, a long battle? Stacey Abrams. I happened to go to law school with her. She clearly took classes that I must have skipped, but she saw the battle for Georgia as a long game. She didn't quit after one federal cycle. She didn't quit after, one. She also didn't assume one role. She was the minority leader at one point. She started nonprofits to fight voting suppression. She ran for governor, and she was always making progress. We have to see this as a long battle, and every strategy and every measurement of how we're doing must be judged in that long frame. Number two, once you see you're in a battle for democracy, and not everyone's going to agree with this, but I believe it passionately, you have to see it's a 50-state battle. It is no longer good enough to only bring our message to a few states that happen to be federal swing states for federal purposes. It's wrong that people are living in essentially laboratories of autocracy with no democracy at all in so many states. But by not competing in those places or even trying, as Drew talked about, you never know where you might win, like Kansas just a few weeks ago. And if you don't bring your message everywhere, a message like Drew said, you also let extremism explode. If there's only one person in the room talking, their message is going to win. And the only competition will be to be more extreme. We have to start standing up and competing everywhere. And when they're being extremists like they are, you can start winning in other places you haven't won in the past. Same story within states. No longer is it good enough to only compete for a few swing districts in a state house. We should no longer let extremists who are voting for crazy laws like abortion bans, no exceptions, to literally not be challenged in the next election, either because no one's running against them or their opponent has so little support they might as well not be running. That again, it's how you lose, but it's also how extremism explodes. Can you imagine voting for these insane laws? You know, arming teachers, deeply unpopular, abortion ban, you know, sending that 10-year-old rape victim to Indiana if you're an Ohio legislator, which I bet 5% of Ohioans support. In Ohio, they voted to require general inspections of girl athletes in sports. That's probably supported by 1% of Ohioans. Can you imagine voting for those things and then not facing a challenge the next November? No one runs against you because we only focus on a few swing districts. No wonder they're extremists. They're rewarded. We don't even challenge them. We have to run everywhere, not because we're necessarily going to win everywhere, but as Drew said and John said, we got to start holding them accountable everywhere. You want that person who voted for those bills to think, my God, there's someone knocking on a door every evening in my district, explaining what an extremist I am, telling them what Drew mentioned about you're letting the rapist pick the mother of your child, of his child. You want them to feel that way, so it starts bringing accountability back to these totally unaccountable levels of office. Fourth, there are only 5 of these things, but all of these to me are the way forward. And I go through in my book, by the way, 30 steps. This is a quick summary of them. I'm sure Drew would tell me 30 steps is terrible, David. Never do that. But number 4, this is not just about Trump. This is so much bigger than Trump. This started after Obama won because of a long history of white backlash whenever there's a diverse democracy.
That's 5 minutes, David.
5 minutes. Okay, I got it. And if Donald Trump had admitted that he lost the day after the election, they still would have banned water at the polls in Georgia. They still would have gone after drop boxes because it's not about Trump. It's about suppressing a diverse majority they're afraid of, just like they would have kept gerrymandering. And this used to be more hypothetical. If Donald Trump is locked up tomorrow, for whatever, all the reasons he could be locked up, they're not going to stop attacking democracy through states. We make a mistake when we make it only about Trump because we give cover to too many Republicans who may not look or sound like Trump, but are attacking democracy every single day, including probably more effectively than he is. In 2020, for example, many voters voted for Biden and then voted for Republican the rest of the way because they had a never Trump frame. Well, guess what? Many of those Republicans went on to do phony audits in Arizona, gerrymander, ban drop boxes, and go forward with a big lie either way, even though they didn't feel like Trump people. We've got to make this about, are you for democracy or not? And if you are, even if you're a Republican, let's work together, or an independent. And if you're not, even if you don't look like Donald Trump or sound like him, we have a problem with you. We're going to be tough on you. The last thing I hope, once you see that we are in a battle for democracy itself, I hope people start to see there is more you can do. And this, I say this respectfully because I think people are doing a lot. The scale of the attack on democracy at the state level, I haven't gone all through all the details, but ALEC, the Koch brothers, this is full time. This is big bucks, Heritage Foundation. And if all we do in our life is a little volunteer work here and there, a few hours here, and we stop after November because we think the cycle's over, we get involved again a year later, the scale of what they are doing is too big to overcome. We have to scale it up in every way. You know, Sherrod Brown, when he was Secretary of State of Ohio, he convinced McDonald's to have a voter registration form on every tray in a McDonald's in Ohio. That's scaling it up. Are you a volunteer at a homeless shelter? Could you ask them, are you registering every voter who comes in this door? Every homeless person? Or at a food bank? Do you run a hair salon? Do you live in a senior center? Are you pushing for voter registration or other ways to engage voters? Are you ensuring that in your part of your state that there is never someone who's unchallenged, who's an extremist? Are you helping recruit? Are you running yourself? There's all sorts of ways that we can take our footprint and influence in our life and put it to work for democracy. And the reason I say this is I worry that unless we do what people like John Lewis and Robert Kennedy said, which was we each create a ripple, and it becomes a flood, that it will never hit the scale of the other side's attack on democracy. So people ask me all the time, these are all somewhat tough presentations. Isn't it too late? The answer is no. We are in a battle for democracy itself. It's the history of our country. That's the battle. It's only too late if we don't get involved. And it's only too late if we don't see the battle for what it is. But the heroes of our history, be it John Lewis or the suffragists, shown us against long odds in that battle for democracy. If people fight hard enough for it, they can overcome the problem. We just have to fight harder, as others said, and we have to fight a lot smarter. And we have to get out of this box of thinking that democracy is sort of intact no matter what, and see that it is directly under attack, and see where it's being attacked, and fight back in all the places where that's happening. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your listening to me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. Okay, for part 2 of our program, now I'm going to invite all our 3 speakers to kind of engage each other in a free-flowing roundtable discussion. I'm going to mostly stand back and I'll just get in to let you know when to wrap up. So over to you, gentlemen. And Drew, why don't you start? If your mute button unmutes.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
I'm just trying to unmute my camera. Although I'm much more handsome this way. Start video. All right.
There you are.
Well, well, I couldn't feel more honored to be on this panel with these 2 gentlemen. You guys were both superb. David, what do you think is it that has led? I mean, you've diagnosed the problem so well at the state level about our inability to get Democrats to focus on the state level, and to. I mean, I could tell you, there's never been a messaging effort. I mean, I'm not telling you anything new, aimed at speaking to Democratic candidates and elected officials at the state levels that reached all 50 states. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who was the chair of the Democratic caucus in Georgia, who a couple of years ago, and I said, well, what kind of resources are you getting from the DLCC? That nothing. We have no information on how to message any topic. No. What do you think is what's the problem? What's the disconnect? It's certainly not impossible for people to imagine that things like abortion are decided at the local level. Things like who gets to vote are decided at the local level. Why can't we figure that out?
I don't. You may know as much as I on this, but I think a couple things. One, we are quick to look for the most amazing, charismatic candidates, and that often makes it federal. We're looking for Obama. Mm-hmm. The Koch brothers could care less if their candidates have any charisma. If they are at that state house, ramming through some crazy bill that's unpopular, gerrymandering themselves into power so they don't lose, they're happy. And so I think we're always looking, and I want inspiration too. It's great, I'm sure, when we all see it, but they have a view of politics that's more about power. And so they understand the institutions that shape the power. And we just, I think, don't think that way. I also think, you and I've talked about this before, we don't also think about message in any broader, smart way. I did an exercise in Ohio where I tried to convince all the folks in Ohio to actually try and be on the same page with message. What's interesting is the lower down the quote unquote totem pole I went, the more people were interested because they didn't have any resources. The higher up you go, everyone has their own pollster and their own consultant, and they paid all this money. So they don't want to adopt some broader brand or some broader thing because they've already paid all this money to do it. But I did find a lot of local state house candidates and local candidates saying, thank you, this is really helpful. This is really giving me, especially if they've never run before. So I think the Democratic Party needs to think that way. But I think it's when you're navigating a bunch of individual politicians, the higher up you go, the more there's a resistance to doing anything but your own team told you. I want to say one other thing on message, by the way, and I think you'd agree with this. And to those watching, especially the candidates, almost nothing I said tonight would I suggest a candidate run on, okay? Except when I was quoting Drew. But here's the messaging advice I put in my book. This is more my message to insiders saying, wake the heck up. This is bad what's happening. That should not be your final 30 days of your campaign. But part and parcel with these rigged and corrupt state houses are extremism that cannot be defended if it's attacked the right way, and public outcomes that are horrific. 4 days of school a week in Kansas because they've underfunded so much. Roads falling apart in Michigan. An energy system that collapsed in Texas so people freeze to death. Part and parcel with corrupt state houses. Schools collapsing in Ohio. Small towns that look like ghost towns. I think the smartest messaging for Democrats in tougher areas is pinpoint the public outcomes that I guarantee you are failing and cannot be defended, and connect that to the kitchen table conversations. Why is I'm blanking her name now. Why do we have a Democratic governor of Kansas? She was running against Chris Kobach. She didn't go on about his voter suppression, although she could have. She ran a simple ad. I'm from Kansas. I had Kansas values growing up, and those values were about education. Why in the hell do we have 4 days of school a week? She's governor. But what's Gretchen Whitmer? Fix the damn roads. We have to connect the failure of these states and show it's not because there's someone at the border that your town and school are dying. It's because of the right-wing policies coming right out of your state house, and they're so gerrymandered, you can't do anything to stop it. And when candidates have taken that smart messaging, they've ended up winning. But I don't think there's any broader group that's helping people think that through. But when the good candidates figure it out, they're actually winning, even in tougher states.
Let me ask you this, David. It strikes me that in some campaigns, they're just silent because they're afraid to say any message at all. Now, in Virginia, we had, I think, a classic example of using the weak underbelly of the system, which is the school boards, to say, they're going to teach critical race theory. You don't want your kids to be inoculated against COVID. Watch out for the LGBTQ kids. They shouldn't be given any special treatment. See what kind of problems they have. And instead of just adopting some message of this is discrimination and that we don't teach, and they kept just saying we don't teach that, but they should have gone another step and said, the question is some institutions have become racist, sometimes with the government itself creating that situation. And if we don't have that dialogue, we don't talk about it, we've lost before we started. But there was, and it was a statewide campaign. I live in Loudoun County, and Loudoun County was like the center of an argument that works statewide, but especially in vote-rich for Democrats, Northern Virginia.
Well, let me just say, one of the problems I think we have, sometimes we get baited into dumb debates and we don't get back to our core message.
Right.
I would tell every candidate, don't get baited. Don't shy away either, but then get back to the fact that the schools are only 4 days a week, or that the roads are falling apart in Michigan. But here's the thing I think Democrats also do. We get bullied into thinking we're in the minority on many issues that we're not. Book banning is really unpopular. Roe v. Wade is very popular. Look at Kansas. Right. And I think we let these little right-wing gerrymandered state houses who are in a little echo chamber convince us that we're the controversial ones. No, you send a 10-year-old girl to Indiana to get an abortion. You're the controversial one. 90% of your own district thinks that's crazy. And so I think we should punch back like Drew says, and then say, we know why you want to change the topic. It's because people froze to death in Texas because you privatize the energy grid. So don't get bullied into thinking we're the minority, because on most issues, now sometimes we may accidentally be that. We may stray a little far, but most of the time, look at Mitch McConnell. He knows this all. Don't say a word, Lindsey Graham. We'd much rather have the state houses pass abortion bans where they can't be held accountable. We don't want Mem and Oz running around on that, or J.D. Vance, although J.D.'s not smart enough to know that. So we're not the minority on most issues. They are. That's why they gerrymander. That's why they suppress. They know they're the minority. So don't shy. Defend where we are. Sherrod Brown's a perfect example of this, by the way. Defend our principles, defend equality, frame it the right way like Drew would, but then get back to the issues like the fact that that people around the kitchen table are thinking about every day in Ohio. Our schools are falling apart, our towns look like hell, our wages are stuck, get back there. I think that's the 1-2 punch, but we get baited, and also we get scared into thinking we're much more controversial on some of these issues than we are.
Well, if the January 6th committee doesn't come out and say prosecute some of these guys, including the head of the snake, and we don't get an indictment before the election, what do you think is the messaging that should be conducted either by candidates or people of wisdom and respectability to the effect that this really matters, the difference between autocracy and democracy right down to these local issues? Now, it appears to me that the Democrats are prepared to run away from that and not talk about it, outside of a couple of speeches by Biden, without any proposed action to go with it.
Yeah. Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Drew as sort of the guru. I've literally read his book probably 5 times backwards and forward. But I wish Biden had done, well, one, and I so agree with Drew.
Right.
If you give a speech, but you're not fighting for it, no one believes you.
Right.
The US Senate had a single vote on voting rights in January. They don't even bring it up later. If you're the average American and you're making a decision, do they really believe this or not? Well, if they had one vote and never talking about it again, like they're embarrassed, it must not be that important. They must not be that threatened. In Ohio, let me do a contrast. Mm-hmm. The Republicans in Ohio, by the way, I'm sorry if I'm yelling, I get fired up real easy. The Republicans in Ohio,
we love it,
were caught violating the Constitution 7 times. They get caught and they do it again and again and again and again, and they never stop. We have a single vote to protect democracy in states against gerrymandering in January. We never bring it up again. So as true, all the speeches in the world are not going to convince Americans it's important if you're not fighting like it's important. If you don't sound a little like I do right now. I mean, I would literally be saying, Chuck Grassley, who complained about family reunions that he was missing, Chuck, you're going to miss every family. It's like what you said about 40 years. Family reunions, you're not going to get to go to the bathroom. We are not going to let you out of this room if you're going to filibuster democracy. No way. Every day, every night. And the Democratic senators, not just the 2 who won't go on filibuster, need to have that attitude that we are not leaving this chamber because we are at an 1890 moment that if we don't fight for democracy, we are going to lose it. They need to feel that way, and then the speeches may actually mean something. But again, going back to your broader question, John, I would not run straight up ads about democracy. I would, if I was running for governor, I would always do what Laura Kelly is the governor of Kansas. I would always connect. I would talk about it like I am to you, to certain insiders. But to the broader electorate, young people are questioning democracy. Their lives have been pretty tough since the day where they were born. Democracy looks pretty broken to them. Others, they care more about they have a tough life, what's happening every day. Connect the failure of democracy to their life. Again, their labor unions are being crushed and they may see wages lower. Their schools are falling apart. Their schools are being taken over by nuts. You name it, connected back to the issues they care about so they see, yeah, I get the democracy part, but my God, I have to figure out where to take my kids on Friday because there's no longer school. I'm pissed off. That's how I would always connect it back to those everyday issues.
Drew, what's the psychological weakness you were referring to about Democrats when it comes to exactly these races?
Do you mean the neurological or the psychological?
Yeah, well, where's the warrior? I mean, Democrats have waged these wars. I mean, real wars. What we can't fight domestically for what we care about.
That's the ironies. If you look at the composition of, say, the House or the Senate at any given time, there are many more veterans who are Democrats. And there are all these Republicans who are acting like, beating their chests like they're warriors, but they all dodged the draft whenever they had a chance to do it. It's like, Kerry against Bush. Which one of them actually fought? Which one of them, claimed the other was a fake war hero? The data that I was referring to is as scary as it is fascinating, and that is that that fear circuitry involved in brain circuitry involved in creating fear responses, including some nuclei in the amygdala, which people have heard a lot about, are not only denser just physically denser in Republicans, in conservatives, but they are more active in conservatives, so that their threshold for detecting fear is very low. Now, they're just pathologically low because anyone who's other is fearful to them. But when you look at Democrats, we have or in these studies, people who self-describe as liberal, they have much denser circuits involved in this part of the brain called the anterior cingulate, which is right back behind here, which is involved in recognizing and monitoring conflict and nuance. And it's actually also more active. Now, we don't know what's chicken and egg on these things, but what Democrats do is whenever we find something scary, we immediately go to the head and we say, pangs of hunger, what can we call that? Food insecurity. I see Dave.
Climate change. It's not global warming. It's a change in the climate.
Oh my God! And it's and the acronyms that we jump to all the time is that I wrote a piece on an opinion piece on why Democrats should absolutely not acronymize the Inflation Reduction Act. It was named that for a reason. Democrats finally did something right on naming a bill. They didn't go, let's see, dream. What can we do that spells out dream? And let's put a little ERS at the end. No one knows what the hell, what are these people dreaming about? Why there's a little ERS? Why isn't a big ERS? But so you want to stay away from that stuff, and you want to say, Inflation Reduction Act speaks to what people are feeling. Don't go to this. Don't go to your head. But we always go to the head. And the Republicans always go to the gut. And if you're choosing between the two in politics, you want to have both head and the gut. That's what we should do. Right. There's no reason to choose one or the other, but the Republicans always choose the gut because they don't have the head. We always choose the head because we're afraid of the gut.
David, don't we have head and gut if we talk about Alito and company on Roe v. Wade and how that was not intended as a gift, but as kind of a political campaign gift for all those people that resisted. And so we continue to have these questions about the court, including the 11th Circuit. Were they going to decide the way they did and prove that they were a court and not hacks? And so far, anyhow, they made that temporary decision. And the question is, does that issue, is that like a backdoor way to get into the corruption of the autocracy without saying that? And talking about Roe v. Wade and taking that right away from women.
Yeah, I mean, I think they clearly, and I'm sure Mitch McConnell knew that the moment that came down, this is a problem. Like, they want to be extreme until it all of a sudden is in the middle of an election cycle. They have to be. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, what's funny is I think these gerrymandered legislatures, they don't really know how extreme they are. Again, the only world that these people have lived in is a world where they've never been in a real election. So they're running around with like-minded people, with extremist interest groups pushing them. I don't think they really appreciate how out of tune they are. And that's the opportunity. I believe this, if people say to me, why would you ever run a gerrymandered district? You're going to lose. First of all, you need to have accountability everywhere. They are scared of even having anyone running against them. Mm-hmm. That's why they gerrymander so much. But they're so way over their skis now on extremism. And Kansas example of this. I believe now with the extremism and someone like Drew guiding the messaging, if you ran in 50 gerrymandered districts now and you gave those people enough support, let's say we take 20 million of Amy McGrath's 100 million. The money's there. We just don't spend it right. Take 20 million and divide it up among all the state house seats that we want to compete in, which is all of them. And give them Drew's messaging guidance for a few days. Get a big seminar. Drew, I'll help pay the way. Right. I bet if you had 50 people challenging in gerrymandered districts, you'd win 4 or 5 of them because they're so extreme now. You would have a Kansas. You'd have an Alaska. But if you never run in those places, you never know where you're going to win. And we don't run and we don't get good messaging. So I think that we have to start running in all these places, and we have to get, if they're too extreme, go after that in smart ways. And yes, no acronyms, no nothing else. Go right at the gut of it. And if their results are terrible, and they will be terrible, when Trump said make America great again, he was getting at the terrible results that are largely in states that are run by Republicans, by the way, because of their trickle-down stuff. That's why these places are terrible. Go after those results. I often go down to a small town near me in Ohio called Manchester. It makes my blood boil. I'm sure you have these in Virginia. Falling apart, like sad as can be. And I'll do a little tape where I'm almost pretending I was a candidate saying, look at this place. Why has this happened? It's generations of unaccountable gerrymandered legislatures doing trickle-down economics, taking your money from this town and giving it away to the top. And we have to start being much more aggressive. So I think it's the extremism and the indefensible records these people have, and we just need to be hitting it nonstop all over the place, not only in a few suburbs and cities, but all over the place.
Gentlemen, this has been an unbelievably fascinating discussion, but we need to wrap up and go to Q&A. And I wanted to let everybody know that we're going to go into Q&A, but David may have to leave. He has another engagement tonight that he couldn't get out of, so he'll leave when he has to. It's been a privilege to hear our expert panelists share their insights, and we look forward to eliciting some additional information through our questions. I've asked my national affairs colleague, Sherry Horowitz, to monitor the Q&A box throughout the program, sorting through and selecting some of your questions for the speakers. She will also ask some questions prepared by the committee. There clearly isn't going to be enough time to ask every question. Sherry will try to identify those that are on topic, not duplicates, and address aspects of the issue not yet considered. Sherry, I may break in from time to time, and I will definitely let you know when it's time for the last question. Again, in case when David leaves, I want to let you know how much we appreciate you for your contributions. But Sherry, I'm going to send it over to you to at least get one question in for David Pepper. Over to you, Sherry.
Okay, this was an audience question from Greg Brandon. I thought this was interesting because it had not come up in the discussion. What are the odds the Republican-controlled state houses will call for an Article 5 constitutional convention? Should Democrats start organizing a response to control such a convention? And how would that take place?
Yeah, I write about this in my book. You know, what's their long game? Clearly, if you watch them, part of their long game is to call a convention through enough state houses passing resolutions for a convention. The odds come back to whether or not we protect state houses. They're not where they need to be yet. And by the way, if you're thinking, well, how can I help right now? And I know you're Virginia, so you don't have a state house race right now. We are only 2 seats from picking up the Arizona State House. We're only 2 seats from the Michigan State House. I think we're 9 or 10 short in Pennsylvania. And if Oz and Fetterman and Shapiro do well enough, maybe we win that. So the odds are 0 if we don't lose more state houses and we gain them. If we continue to slack on state houses, they will do it. If they, Jane Mayer came through Ohio and she kept asking me these hypotheticals. And I'd always say, expect the worst. They'll do the worst. They'll pass the worst law. They'll do the most extreme thing. In their world right now, the only incentive is to be an extremist. We help that by not challenging them. There is no incentive to be a moderate in their world. That's how you actually lose. So of course they will vote for the thing that everyone wants them to do, which is a constitutional convention where they could do so much damage, by the way. How do we stop it? We just focus on state houses and we don't let them win anymore. And we gain the ones we can gain, like Arizona, Michigan, and we keep plugging away. So it's certainly part of a big picture plan. And a lot of state houses have already passed resolutions calling for that convention. And once they'd have, and this would be exactly what a minority rule mindset would get you. Wonderful. We've locked down tons of state houses where we largely represent the minority. And those state houses together have called a convention where the minority is in one convention changing the Constitution and they have the power to do it. That is a very scary proposition. And they're close enough that it should scare us, but they're also far away enough that if we work hard and keep them from winning any more state houses, we can stop it from happening.
Okay, this is a question from the committee. You write about the need for Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and For the People Act, noting that the Brennan Center concluded that the latter alone would thwart virtually every vote suppression bill currently pending in the states. Why do you think these weren't made a higher priority early on in the Biden administration? And has that window of opportunity been missed?
I really worry that they just didn't really appreciate, for reasons that we've talked about, the risk democracy we face and the state house level risk. And this is easy to say in hindsight, although I will take credit. I wrote the book before it was hindsight. They should have said to people like Joe Manchin, you want infrastructure? We need voting rights. They should have made that deal at the very beginning. Not once it was out of the barn, you're not going to get them back. But we need, you want this? We need one thing. Everything flows from democracy. We can do all the other bills and healthcare and lock in a right to choose federally. But if we have democracy, if we don't have democracy, nothing else will happen. They should have seen that. And one other thing, I go through this in the book, and John, I think, is more of a lawyer than I am, but there is a phrase in the Constitution called the guarantee clause. It's lost in time. It is a guarantee that every state shall have, the United States guarantees every state a Republican form of government. And by that, they meant every state shouldn't be, this is not about the old Greece versus, democracy, republic. They meant not a monarchy. They meant the people are sovereign. And when you take an oath of the Constitution, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Biden, you are taking an oath that every state in this country should have a Republican form of government. And what does that mean? That the filibuster has no business stopping you from protecting democracy in states. As a constitutional matter, it makes zero sense. Why is there a guarantee clause in the Constitution? Because James Madison and others worried that state houses would be used as a backdoor to undermine America's democracy, that they were easily corruptible. They thought the monarchy might actually go through states, take all the powers I described, and use states to have the convention we talked about, to do other things. So they said, yes, we're giving the states a lot of power, but on one condition: they must be Republican forms of government. And I think if that's an oath you take as part of the Constitution, you do not take an oath to filibuster. Joe Biden, Joe Manchin, all of them, if they see that threat, they have a duty to protect democracy in states, which means the laws like the John Lewis Law and the Freedom to Vote Act aren't just about some voting rights. They're about democracy itself. And once you see it that way, they're at a much higher plane of importance than anything else. It's part of your oath as a senator. One final thing, and I got to jump off. The Supreme Court of the United States has also ruled for a century that actions per the guarantee clause are not subject to court review. That if you passed a law saying you can't gerrymander these ways, that's it. I think they should act upon this guarantee and this oath. Again, this is the one where Drew is. They got to be bolder. If the Supreme Court especially says this independent state legislature rogue theory is in place, that's when the Senate and president come along and say, you want to go there? Well, we're going to act upon our guarantee clause power, and we're going to write a law right now that forbids this gerrymandering in states immediately forevermore. They have the power to do that, and they didn't see that early on. My hope, by the way, is they still have time to do it now. If they don't, and if we win the Senate and the House, it should be the first thing they do when they come back. We cannot afford any more to wait. I worry deeply that if this window closes and we don't win back the Senate and the House, the lack of those voting bills we will regret for the rest of our lives. But so they should still act. I think they should still call into session and demand it before the end of the cycle. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen. But if I were there, that's what I'd be demanding. I would do what Chris Murphy did on guns for democracy right now. Thanks, everybody. Sorry to leave you talking like that, but I really, really appreciate everyone on and really enjoyed talking to the panelists.
That's a good way to
David,
finish.
we appreciate it.
Take care. Stay in touch.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I'll direct the next question to Drew. Many people asked this question when you mentioned that the January 6 people should have been arrested. Basically, who would have arrested insurrectionists, or how could they have been arrested while Trump was still in the White House, still in charge and complicit?
Great question. I'll give you two answers to that. One was that piece that I mentioned that I wrote called All the President's Mental Disorders back in October 2020. It ended with a very cautionary note, basically saying, given what we know about his personality, about his psychopathology, the fact that that you can't judge him against the norms of ordinary people because his brain does not function the way ours does. He doesn't have a conscience. He doesn't have empathy. He can't think. He's impulsive. He can't think ahead 5 minutes about what if I say this now, etc. Given all that, and given that he started to make the moves that he made to replace even his loyal Trumpites with people who were people who didn't seem like they'd fall on their sword for him either politically or legally, he started to replace them one by one in a slow Saturday Night Massacre over several weeks. You know, my argument was that the danger to our republic that he was going to pose between October and November when he lost, and January 21st when Joe Biden was inaugurated, was going to be the biggest danger, most dangerous period of his presidency. And the fact that the first point I'm going to make is simply that I couldn't get that paper published because editors kept saying, "Oh, this is old news. You know, we know that there's something wrong with him. You know, we're moving on now from Trump." It's like, can you really not see this thing unfolding? Like, is it not obvious? And that again speaks to me to the same problem with, you know, many of the people in the media who run the media are Democrats. You know, they have the same flawed psychology that the rest of Democrats do, who are running things, and they simply couldn't see it. Again, a comic, Bill Maher could see it 4 years earlier, but they couldn't see it 3 months earlier. But the second thing is, this is when I was saying that the institutions of our democracy did not hold. That by January 7th at the latest, there should have been hundreds of members of Congress, as well as everyone in that room should have been in prison. And the fact that they weren't would suggest to me, and John can comment on this because again, he knows the law better than I do, but on January 21st, I would have rounded up all the officials who did not put them away and put them in prison for being part of the conspiracy. Because you do not, while you watch for 3.5 hours as this is all unfolding, you do not act as the National Guard. You do not act as the Secret Service. You do not act as the DOJ. You do not act as the FBI. You do not act as even the DOD. If all those initials can't act, then they can act really nicely in prison as bunkmates.
Well, let me take your invitation, Drew. First of all, I think you're right about the people not commenting. But it's like the same reason that the Republicans in the House and the Senate didn't. And that is that they're afraid to take on the bully. They're afraid to stand up to him and say, enough, we're not doing this. And you were absolutely right. The day after the insurrection, when there's no question in anybody's mind, and McCarthy hadn't walked back his statement yet as the minority leader in the House, why isn't the FBI rounding these people up? You know, that like the joke, round up the usual suspects. Well, they were out there in plain view. And at the very least, they should have been cabined in their offices and interviewed and maybe held as material witnesses until we knew exactly what they'd done. In any other nation, I think on earth, and I'm talking about democratic nations, Republican forms of government, that's what would have happened. Now, you and I jaywalk and we could get stopped. But these guys were impenetrable. Why? Is it because Trump is like a mobster who by coercion and force and terror keeps people in line, including all these people in the media, all those Democrats afraid that they're going to have a primary opponent? I mean, look what happened to, the Republicans who voted for impeachment. He was down there on his revenge tour to get at them. And that counts among people who don't have the courage to stand up to their oath to preserve and protect our democracy. And it's no accident that JFK's book is a thin tome about the profiles in courage. And that's the challenge to America. We talk about we go to the moon, we do these things, but we're not doing any of those things. A very narrow group of people do those things. And then we say, why are they going to the moon? Why do they want to go to Mars? Why do you want to clean up the environment? I want to get mine, you know. And that's a current across the society, and we're creating a situation in which Sir Thomas More in a play once said, yeah, if you can tear down all the laws, can you stand in the wind that would blow? And the answer is day by day, we're having difficulty. We're talking more and more about violence and coercion and threats and stuff like that. And if we had done something on January the 7th or January the 22nd, instead of waiting a year and a half and prosecuting people on bullshit trespass charges mostly, then we wouldn't say, oh, the Justice Department is tied up because we're chasing the rabble that these guys invoked to tear down our Capitol. Well, that's just not acceptable. So that was my slight addition to your remarks.
Once again, we have a thin slice of paper that doesn't even separate us. Yeah.
No, I think so. I think we'll have to do more of these. Sandra will have to set up things for the three of us, the three musketeers. Yeah.
Sounds like a great plan to me.
Sandra, should I keep going with questions?
Sure.
Yes,
that's
go
what
ahead.
we do.
I'll let you know when it's time for the last question.
Okay, so even with Trump and his antics and those of other Republicans in the national news every day, there remain millions of apathetic and disengaged voters. How can we appeal to them to get them engaged and ensure that they vote to protect our rights and our democracy? And maybe as a corollary to that, how do we ultimately win back the Trump voters that still attend his rallies and still refuse to accept the results of 2020? What can we do to break the spell?
Well, people who are putting their finger up in the air, who are doing this kind of stuff, those people are lost. I mean, we have to accept the fact that these people are not reconcilable, but there are Republicans that are very upset about what's going on here. And the truth is, the voters rightly, the ones who care about our democracy, their spirits are broken because they don't see their views being recognized in the action of the government. They hear talk. I have, like everybody else, I have Twitter followers and other social media and so forth. And what do I get? Oh, yeah, well, I'll wait and see if they do anything. Yeah, they serve subpoenas. They did this, they did that. But none of that is grabbing Trump by the scruff of the neck and putting him in custody, charging him with an offense. Even now, it's a civil offense. And consider the fact that the voters know that the DA killed the almost same criminal prosecution that the AG brought as a civil charge, having that charge approved by the former DA, Vance, and by the top prosecutors that he had, and one resigned because of it. So what do you think as a voter when we have the AG brings a civil case, which is within her purview, her jurisdiction, and the local DA did nothing with probably basically the same information that had been approved by the former DA and by his prosecutors? You say the fix is in. And Bragg, frankly, should be investigated. How did that happen? How did that happen? And, he gave some short comments about, well, maybe now we'll look into it. Well, yeah, okay. The check is in the mail. This guy, and my old office, the Southern District of New York, forgive me for going on, but this guy Berman, who was the U.S. attorney, should have spoken up when he was thrown out the door. He knew these things, and a fellow that I have great respect for, Greg Craig, was charged with not registering because of representing foreign governments. And they knew that it was a political charge because the AG, the then AG, Barr, who's running around now taking credit loops like he's a great guy because he's talking to us about stuff. And he's trying to clean up his reputation so he doesn't end up on the wrong side of a jail cell. And what are they doing about it? They're not doing anything about it. They let these guys do this stuff. But Barr, basically said to Berman, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District, my old office, well, we need a couple of Democrats to prosecute. Otherwise, the election that's coming up in 2020, we're going to look bad. So we want you to do Kerry and we want you to do Craig. And they went ahead and he never said anything about it. And a selective and vindictive prosecution is information that is entitled to be given to the person who's accused. And that was never given to him. And he let the case go forward. And yes, he was acquitted because it was a bullshit case from the beginning. Berman, instead of going out to dinner with media types and so forth, he should be called on the carpet. The story is not right about him. No more than Rosen does nothing about Clark, even though they're all in the White House and they're all going to quit if he manipulates them to help overthrow the government. What kind of people are these? They have no business in public life. These people should be at least marched down the street and shamed. They should be denied every public office they could ever have. And we're not doing that. And because we don't do that, we give life to these criminals. Sorry, but that's my light version of it.
Two people asked related questions about dark money. Michelle Menapace asks, while grassroots volunteer efforts can have an effect, what about a major funder for the efforts to save democracy? Is there a progressive equivalent to what the Koch brothers do? And what's the best effort to focus on with such money? And Dave, I'm probably butchering this, but Kokendorfer asked, what about Citizens United and dark money? What can we do to eliminate or minimize the impact of that and lobbyist influence? Either of you.
I'll jump in with a couple of comments. The first is that before Trump and especially January 6th, I believed that the biggest threat to our democracy was in fact dirty money, and the fact that we've seen the rise of inequality and the rise of corporate money and money that goes along with wealth funding campaigns at just exponentially increasing levels. Those are correlated about 0.8. And the average person is right if he or she has the sense that that big business and wealthy individuals are buying influence, and they're using that influence in turn to increase inequality, which in turn gives them more money to buy influence. And it happens at every level of government, by the way. If people understood, for example, that 80% of the funds that go to Superior Court judges in counties come from the attorneys who appear before them, they would. I mean, it is mind-boggling when you think about what that actually means in terms of the impact that has on everything from civil and criminal cases through divorce cases, custody cases, and how they're adjudicated. Now you just take that all the way up to the to state and federal races, and it's horrific. But again, clearly the Republicans bear the lion's share of the blame on this because they're all bought. I mean, it's very hard to find a Republican who isn't taking so much money that you can't, at the very least, question the appearance of impropriety, if not impropriety. But about half of Democrats are taking that kind of dirty money too. And the only way that you clean up that system is you get rid of it. And if you think about what's happening to the next generation with climate change because of money from the oil and gas industry and coal industries, from the Koch brothers, from the people who fund Joe Manchin, from his little side businesses in West Virginia. If you think about why we had the deregulation that led to the Great Recession, the deregulation in Wall Street and all the derivatives trading, and you look at and the exploding mortgages, etc. You can go down the list of one after another issue, and they are just all so tied to money. And probably the biggest difference between our democracy and any other Western democracy is that our democracy is controlled by that kind of money. And Germany has, I don't remember what the period is, 4 weeks, 6 weeks that they can spend some money, but even then there's limits on what they can spend. And that the whole idea that John, maybe you can comment this, the whole idea that has infected our system, that money is speech. I always wondered why I couldn't speak to the next cop who stopped me for speeding and just said, I'd like to talk with you with these couple $100. It's really important. I'd like to have a conversation with you. I don't understand how that's any different. And frankly, the average American, I did work on this before, 85% of Americans across the political spectrum view campaign dollars as legalized bribery. And they are absolutely correct.
Right.
I'm going to interrupt here. John, we don't have time for a separate question, but John, if you'd like to make a comment on this topic before we close out Q&A, feel free.
Giving an Irishman an opportunity to speak is always a bad
I know.
Now I'll try to control brevity on this point.
About a minute.
Well, picking up the last comment, there is in the law two crimes, gratuity and bribery. And I've always been at a loss to understand how that differs from giving someone a contribution and packing thousands of dollars the night before a vote and not saying that this joker, who is either the subcommittee or committee chair, is about to vote and lead his members in support of a proposition that group supports. And so what do we have? We wear these people down. I've had the view that maybe I was saved because maybe I don't have the will to resist a system in which the day you get elected, you have to raise money for the next election 2 years down the road. You're depending on all these PACs and so forth. And pretty soon you're saying to yourself, well, if I talk to Joe, who just lives down the corner, I'm not going to get a contribution. But if these guys come in, I'm going to get 5 and 5 for the primary and the general election. I've got 10 for the day. I can go home. I've raised the money. And so this distortion, you start out as these rough hewn stones, and gradually you're worn down by the water of corruption, by the money they give you, by the speech they declare it is, so they can bullshit us into thinking that that really is speech and that we can authorize buying the whole system because they can't get people legitimately to vote for them. But if they have the money, they can put out disinformation that helps them get elected by scoring against whomever you are running against them. That's the end of my remark.
Sandra,
Okay.
can I add a 30-second comment to that?
Sure, go ahead. If we run over, we run over. That's
Oh,
okay.
no, this is my last
It
30
won't be
seconds.
much. It won't be
But
much.
now it speaks to mechanism for this. You know, a lot of people have proposed potential solutions to this that could work. Larry Lessig, a professor of constitutional law at Harvard, has done some of the best work on this. He and I worked together back in about a decade ago, where he was leading the policy side and I was leading the messaging side on campaign finance reform. Among other things, we learned that don't call it frickin' campaign finance reform. call it fair elections or clean elections. Fair elections works well with everyone. Clean elections doesn't do so well with elected officials. They don't like the idea that they're taking dirty money. But the you know the idea that Larry had and developed, that there were similar ideas floating out there, but he really developed it well, was something like crowdsourcing. You know, you basically take something like the $6 billion in subsidies we give oil companies that they don't need, and use that money so that that you have a 5-to-1, say, or 6-to-1 matching program for state, local, federal candidates. You simply say, you know, get a $25 contribution from your neighbor, and if you'll then get $125 for it. And if enough of your neighbors listen to you and say, you know what, I like what this person's saying, you get more and more of your neighbors doing this. You just have to put a limit on what the upper level of the contribution is. If you do that, then you actually have a crowdsourced democratic system of financing elections, and knock yourself out. Spend $12 billion on an election. It doesn't matter at that point, and it doesn't advantage billionaires and big corporations.
I'm glad you added that, Drew. Appreciate it. Okay, we are now wrapping up. We're at the end of our program. And on behalf of the FCDC National Affairs Committee, I want to thank our distinguished and passionate panelists for your in-depth analyses of the current unprecedented perils to our democracy and offering strategies to fight back. I also want to thank our audience for your attention and hopefully your tenacious activism. Thomas Jefferson warned, when once a republic is corrupted, there is no possibility of remedying any of the growing evils, but by removing the corruption and restoring its lost principles. Every other correction is either useless or a new evil. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans have infected our republic with the evil corruption about which Jefferson cautioned. To preserve our democracy and restore the principles lost, every one of us must unflinchingly fight to hold them legally accountable for their crimes, squash their influence, and remove them from power. As President Biden also warned in his Philadelphia speech, for a long time, we've told ourselves that American democracy is guaranteed, but it's not. We have to defend it, protect it, stand up for it, each and every one of us. This completes our forum, and I thank you for joining us. And to all of you democracy warriors, we wish you good night and victory in our ongoing struggle.